The morning sun cast a warm glow over Willow Creek, a quiet little town where people knew each other by name and where life moved at a comfortable pace. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved from their porches, where kids rode their bikes without a care in the world, and where trouble, real trouble, felt like something that only happened in big cities far away. Emma Carter had been up since dawn, carefully arranging her small lemonade stand at the corner of Main Street, just outside her grandmother's bakery. She smoothed out the bright yellow tablecloth, making sure it lay perfectly flat. The wooden sign, hand-painted in big, cheerful letters, read, "Emma's Lemonade, all proceeds help kids at Willow Creek Children's Hospital." Next to it sat a clear glass jar, already holding a few crumpled dollar bills and loose change from early morning customers. At just 12 years old, Emma had more determination than most grown-ups. This stand wasn't just about selling lemonade. It was about keeping a promise she had made to her mother before she passed away. Emma's mom had spent her last months in and out of that hospital, and she had always told her daughter that kindness was stronger than fear. That no matter how small an act of good seemed, it had the power to change the world. So every summer morning, Emma set up her stand, poured ice-cold lemonade into mason jars, and greeted customers with a warm smile. It was supposed to be just another peaceful morning in Willow Creek. Then came the sound. At first, it was just a low rumble, distant but growing. The kind of noise that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up before your brain even registered why. The friendly chatter on the sidewalk faded. A man walking his dog paused mid-step. A mother gently pulled her child closer. The rumble grew into a roar, deep, guttural, unrelenting. Motorcycles, not just one or two, a whole pack, and not just any pack. The Iron Jackals. Everyone in Willow Creek knew that name. They weren't just a motorcycle gang. They were a force of intimidation, a group of men who had spent years making sure the town remembered exactly who was in charge. They didn't just pass through. They lingered. They took what they wanted. And nobody dared to stop them. Emma swallowed hard, but didn't move. Her fingers tightened around the handle of the lemonade pitcher, knuckles white. The first bike came into view, its chrome frame gleaming under the morning sun. Black leather, seats worn from years of hard rides. The rider, a towering man with long sun-bleached hair and a scar running down his cheek, pulled up just feet from Emma's stand. Another bike rolled in beside him, then another, and another. Before long, the sidewalk outside the bakery was swallowed by the deep hum of idling engines. The leader, a man the town only knew as Razor, swung his leg over his bike and stepped forward. He moved slowly, deliberately, the kind of walk that told the world he had never had to rush for anything in his life. He pulled off his sunglasses and studied Emma like she was something interesting beneath a microscope. "Well, well," he drawled, voice rough as gravel. "A little businesswoman, huh?" Emma's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stand tall. "Would you like some lemonade, sir?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. One of the other bikers snorted. "Ain't that sweet?" His grin was all teeth. "You hear that, Razor? She's real polite." Razor smirked, tilting his head as he glanced down at the donation jar. "That's a nice little collection you got there. Bet you've made a lot this morning." Emma nodded cautiously. "It's all for the children's hospital." "That so?" Razor's fingers tapped against the wooden stand. "See, the thing is, nothing happens in Willow Creek without us knowing about it. Without us getting a little share of the profits." He didn't have to say it outright. Everyone knew what it meant. Protection money. Even kids weren't off limits. Emma's stomach twisted, but she refused to look away. "This money is for sick kids," she said firmly. "It's not mine to give." A tense silence stretched between them. The other bikers shifted, watching their leader for a reaction. Razor's smirk twitched, just slightly. Then, without warning, he reached for the donation jar. Emma's hand shot out, grabbing the glass before he could. It wasn't smart, it wasn't safe, but in that moment she refused to back down. Razor let out a slow, amused chuckle. "You've got guts, kid," he murmured, "but guts don't mean much in a place like this." The man beside him stepped forward, his heavy boot knocking over one of the lemonade jars. It shattered against the pavement, spilling golden liquid onto the ground. Gasps rippled through the small crowd that had gathered nearby. But no one moved. Emma's fingers curled into fists at her sides, but she still didn't step back. This was her stand, her fight. Razor exhaled through his nose like he had just lost interest. "Think about what I said," he muttered. "We'll be back." With that, he turned, climbed onto his bike, and with a deafening roar, the gang peeled away, leaving behind a cloud of dust the stench of gasoline and a young girl standing in the middle of the street, fists clenched, staring at the wreckage of her hard work. The silence that followed was almost heavier than the noise had been. Emma bent down, gathering the broken glass with steady hands. A tear burned at the corner of her eye, but she blinked it away. She wouldn't let them win. People watched. Some whispered, some just shook their heads and walked away. But then, one person stepped forward. An old man, his back slightly hunched, his face weathered with years of work and worry. Walter set a fresh $20 bill into the donation jar and gave Emma a firm nod. "Don't let them scare you, kid," he said. "This town ain't theirs." And just like that, another hand dropped in a $5 bill. Then another. And another. A quiet resistance had begun. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The question is, what would you do? Would you stand your ground? Or walk away? Tell us in the comments below. And if you believe that kindness and courage can change everything, hit like, subscribe, and share this story. Because, trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The next morning, Emma set up her stand just like always, but something was different. The usual ease of Willow Creek was gone, replaced by something heavier. People weren't stopping to chat like they used to. A woman who usually smiled and waved at Emma barely made eye contact as she hurried past. Mr. Dawson, the mailman, gave her a tight-lipped nod, but didn't linger like he normally would. Even the air felt thicker, weighed down by an unspoken tension. Emma knew why. Everyone had seen what happened yesterday. Everyone knew what the Iron Jackals were capable of, and now, as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. She didn't have to wait long. That same low, growling roar of engines cut through the morning air, and this time it was unmistakable. They were coming back. Emma's hands gripped the edges of her stand as 6 motorcycles rolled into view, engines snarling like wild animals. They didn't just pull up this time. They parked. One by one, the riders climbed off their bikes, their black leather vests emblazoned with the Iron Jackals insignia. A snarling wolf's head surrounded by jagged metal. The leader, Jack Razor Thompson, moved first. Tall, broad-shouldered, and built like a man who had spent his life fighting. His way to the top, Razor wasn't loud or reckless like some of the others. No, he was the kind of dangerous that didn't need to shout to be heard. He strolled toward Emma's stand with an easy confidence, hands in the pockets of his worn jeans, sunglasses hiding whatever thoughts lingered behind those dark eyes. Emma swallowed hard but refused to move. Razor reached the stand and tapped one calloused finger against the wooden counter as if testing its strength. Then he sighed, shaking his head like a disappointed teacher. "You're a stubborn one, aren't you?" he murmured. Emma didn't answer. Razor turned slightly, glancing at the clear donation jar sitting beside her cash box. A few crisp bills from this morning's sales lay inside, stacked neatly beneath yesterday's growing collection. "See? Here's the thing," Razor said, tapping the glass jar once. "Nothing in Willow Creek happens without us knowing about it. And nothing happens for free. If you're making money out here, kid, then you owe us a cut." Emma's stomach twisted, but she forced her voice to stay steady. "This money isn't mine," she said. "It's for the kids at the hospital." Razor smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Yeah? And what happens if something unexpected happens? Someone bumps into this nice little stand of yours, jars go crashing down, maybe a table leg breaks?" He let the words settle, tilting his head slightly, watching her reaction. Emma knew what this was. It wasn't just a demand, it was a test. A test to see if she would cave like everyone else. She didn't. Emma squared her shoulders and met his gaze. "Then I'll clean it up and set it back up again." The smile dropped from Razor's face, a flicker of something, annoyance, surprise, crossed his expression. Behind him, a few of the other jackals shifted, exchanging glances. Razor's jaw tensed, and for a moment, Emma wondered if she had pushed too far. Then, just as quickly as it came, the tension eased. He exhaled sharply through his nose and let out a low chuckle. "You're a real piece of work, kid." He shook his head and turned to his men. "Guess we'll have to check in on this little enterprise more often." And just like that, they were gone. The roar of their engines filled the air again as the gang rode off, leaving behind nothing but dust and the uncomfortable silence of the townspeople who had been watching from a safe distance. Emma let out a slow breath, her hand still gripping the counter so tightly that her knuckles ached. For a moment, no one moved. Then, from across the street, a voice called out, "You all right, kid?" Emma looked up to see Walter Jensen, a retired cop who had lived in Willow Creek for decades, walking toward her. His white hair stuck out from under an old baseball cap, and though he moved slower than he used to, there was still something solid about him, something unshakable. "I'm fine," Emma said, though her heart was still racing. Walter studied her for a long moment, then glanced down the street where the jackals had disappeared. "They won't stop, you know," he said, voice low. "They've marked you now. They'll keep coming back." Emma nodded. She knew that. Walter sighed, rubbing his jaw. Damn shame this town lets them walk all over it. Emma wasn't sure what to say. A door opened behind them and Linda Carson, owner of the Willow Cafe, stepped out. She was in her 50s, tough as nails, and hadn't backed down from anything in her life. But even she looked uneasy as she approached. "You sure you want to keep doing this, sweetheart?" Linda asked, concern lacing her voice. "Nobody would blame you if you packed up." Emma set her jaw. "I made a promise," she said simply. Walter exhaled through his nose, something between frustration and admiration flashing across his weathered face. Linda shook her head, muttering under her breath, "That girl's got more backbone than half the men in this town." The tension in the air hadn't lifted. If anything, it had deepened, because Emma wasn't backing down. And now, the jackals knew it. The next day, they came back. Not just once. Every day. They didn't always say much. Sometimes they just parked across the street watching. Other times, one of them would swagger over, making small talk that wasn't really small talk, just veiled threats wrapped in casual words. They never outright attacked her stand. Not yet, but they were waiting, watching, waiting for her to break, waiting for her to run, waiting for her to fall in line like everyone else. But Emma Carter wasn't running, and neither was Walter. Neither was Linda. The jackals might have ruled this town for years, but that was about to change. The sun had barely risen when Emma sat on the wooden steps of her grandmother's house, watching the soft light creep across the quiet streets of Willow Creek. The morning air was cool, carrying the distant scent of fresh bread from the bakery. Down the road, It was peaceful, almost like nothing had changed, almost like she wasn't waking up every morning bracing for another visit from the Jackals. But things had changed. The Iron Jackals weren't just a problem. They were her problem. Now, and the town was watching. Some with quiet support, some with whispered doubts, and some, Emma knew, were waiting for her to fail. She wrapped her arms around her knees, her gaze drifting toward the small leather journal resting on her lap. Inside, it was a letter she had written but never sent, a letter to her father. She traced her fingers over the cover, hesitating before flipping it open. The pages inside were filled with neat, careful handwriting, each word a reflection of thoughts she hadn't dared to say out loud. Dear Dad, I don't know when you'll read this, or if I'll ever get the courage to send it. I know you're out there protecting people just like you always have, but I wish you were here. Things in Willow Creek aren't the same anymore. Mom used to say that this town was built on kindness, but I don't think that's true anymore. People are scared. They don't stand up to the Jackals. They just let them take whatever they want. And now they're trying to take something from me too. I know you'd probably tell me to be careful. Maybe even tell me to pack up the stand and let it go. But I can't, Dad. I made a promise. Emma closed the journal, her fingers tightening around its edges. That promise. It was the only thing keeping her moving forward. She glanced toward the small wooden rocking chair on the porch, her mother's chair. It sat empty now, swaying gently in the morning breeze. Margaret Carter had been the strongest person Emma had ever known. She wasn't a soldier like Dad, but in many ways, she had fought battles just as fierce. As a nurse at Willow Creek Children's Hospital, her mother had spent her life helping others, working long hours, staying at the bedsides of children who were too sick to go home, and even at the very end, when her own illness had stolen the strength from her body, she had never let it take her kindness. The last time Emma had seen her mother truly strong was the summer before she passed away. It had been one of those golden afternoons where the world felt warm and endless. Emma had sat beside her mom in that same rocking chair, her small fingers tracing the worn wood as they talked. "You know, sweet pea," her mother had said, her voice soft but steady. "It's easy to be kind when life is good, but real kindness, the kind that matters, that's what you show when things are hard." Emma had scrunched her nose. But what if being kind doesn't fix anything? Her mother had smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's face. Kindness isn't about fixing things, Em. It's about not letting the bad things change who you are. It's about showing the world that no matter how hard it gets, you won't let it take away your light. Emma had held on to those words, and now, sitting on that same porch, staring at that same empty chair, she held on to them even tighter. Because the truth was, it would be easier to give up. It would be easier to pack up the lemonade stand, let the Jackals have their way, and go back to being invisible. A lot of people in town thought she should. She could hear them whispering whenever she walked down Main Street. "She's just a kid. She's going to make things worse. Someone needs to talk some sense into her before it's too late." Even people who cared about her were worried. Mr. Wilson, the barber, had pulled her aside yesterday and slipped a $10 bill into her pocket, telling her to use it for something else. Anything else. Her teacher, Ms. Avery, had stopped her after school, a deep crease of worry in her brow. "Emma," she had said gently, "sometimes being brave means knowing when to walk away." And then there was her grandmother. Margaret's mother, Eleanor Carter, had always been strong-willed, but Emma could see the fear in her eyes whenever the Jackals came around. "You think you're being like your mother," she had said last night, standing in the dim glow of the kitchen. "But your mother was smart enough to know when to fight and when to step back." Emma had clenched her fists at that. She never backed down when someone needed her. "This isn't the same, Emma," her grandmother had snapped, her voice breaking in a way that made Emma's heart ache. Your mother was fighting for her patients. You're fighting against a gang, and they don't care how much heart you have." Emma had stormed off after that, but now, sitting here on the porch, she knew her grandmother wasn't angry. She was scared. Scared of losing someone else. Scared that Emma's promise was going to get her hurt. But what scared Emma more, what she couldn't accept, was the idea of breaking that promise. Because if she stopped now, if she let the Jackals take away the stand, then it wouldn't just be about lemonade anymore. It would be about everything her mother had stood for. It would be about what kind of person Emma wanted to be. She stood up, squaring her shoulders. The Jackals weren't going to stop coming. She knew that now, and maybe no one else would stand up to them, but she would, even if it scared her, even if people whispered, even if her father never read the letter she wrote him. Because in the end, it wasn't about fighting back, it was about holding her ground, and no one, no gang, no threat, no fear was going to take that away from her. The night was thick with silence, the kind that felt unnatural, too still, too expectant. The streets of Willow Creek were deserted, save for the soft hum of streetlights flickering over empty sidewalks. A slight breeze carried the scent of pine and warm asphalt, rustling the fabric of Emma's lemonade stand sign, which still swayed gently from the wooden counter. Everything looked peaceful, but peace never lasted long when the Iron Jackals were involved. They came when the town slept, when no one was looking, when no one was awake to stop them. It started with the low growl of approaching engines, distant at first, then closer. A pack of motorcycles, rolling through the quiet streets like shadows with headlights, slowing as they reached Main Street. They didn't have to speak. They didn't have to knock. They never knocked. The first boot hit the wooden stand with a crack so loud it ripped through the silence of the night. Then came another, and another, the crash of shattering glass, the sharp splintering of wood, the echo of destruction. Emma's lemonade stand, the place where she had poured every ounce of love, every memory of her mother, it was being torn, apart piece by piece. One of them, Spike, the same one who had sneered at her days before, grabbed the donation jar off the counter. He rattled it next to his ear, listening to the coins inside before tossing it to another jackal. They all laughed as quarters and dollar bills spilled onto the pavement like worthless scraps. Someone else ripped the hand-painted sign off the stand, the same one she had carefully nailed into place weeks ago. They weren't just stealing. They weren't just breaking things. They were sending a message. And then, in the final act of mockery, Razor, their leader, stepped forward, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a thick black marker. In bold, slashing letters, he scrawled across what was left of the wooden sign, "This town belongs to us." Then, as quickly as they had come, the Jackals climbed back onto their bikes, engines roaring through the empty streets as they disappeared into the night. By the time Willow Creek woke up, Emma's stand was nothing but wreckage. Emma stood there at sunrise, staring at the ruins of everything she had built. The wooden counter was cracked straight through the middle. The chairs lay in pieces, their legs snapped and discarded like trash. Glass from her lemonade jars glittered across the sidewalk, reflecting the early morning light like tiny knives. But the sign was what made her stomach twist into knots. "This town belongs to us." The words glared back at her, defiant and final, like a challenge. A small crowd had gathered by then, whispers, murmurs, shaken heads. Miss Avery, her teacher, clutched her chest. "Oh, Emma." Mr. Wilson, the barber, exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Damn cowards, doing this to a kid." But no one moved. No one touched the broken pieces. No one dared to pick them up. Except Walter. The old ex-cop stepped forward, his boots crunching over the broken glass as he took in the destruction, his gray brows furrowed, deep lines cutting into his weathered face. This is how they operate, he muttered. Fear. Control. They want people to be too scared to stand up to them. Beneath his breath, he cursed softly. Then he turned to Emma. They expect you to cry, kid. They expect you to walk away. But Emma didn't cry. She clenched her fists. She could feel her nails digging into her palms, could feel the burn in her throat. But she wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Walter nodded approvingly. Beside him, Linda, the cafe owner, stepped forward. We can't let them keep doing this, she said, glancing at the others gathered around. We all saw this coming, and what did we do? Nothing. Ms. Avery frowned, shifting uneasily. Linda, it's not that simple. You know how dangerous they are. But that's the point, isn't it? Linda shot back, eyes flashing. We all just sit in our shops, hoping they don't notice us. They've already taken over this town, and we let them. Her words hung in the air. Uncomfortable. True. Walter crouched down, picking up a broken piece of wood from the wreckage of the stand. He examined it for a moment, then tossed it aside. Emma, he said, standing up again. What are you gonna do now? It was the question the whole town was thinking. Everyone was waiting for her to cry, to crumble, to say she'd had enough, but she lifted her chin just enough to let them know she hadn't broken. I'm rebuilding. For a moment there was silence. Then Walter smirked. Good, he said, rolling up his sleeves. Because we're gonna help. And just like that, the tide began to turn. Captain William Carter sat on the edge of his cot, the dim glow of his satellite phone casting shadows across his tired face. He had spent the last 12 hours navigating the rugged, unforgiving terrain of a foreign land, ensuring the safety of his men. But none of that prepared him for the message he had just received. Willow Creek. Emma. The stand. Destroyed. His pulse pounded in his ears. He read the words again, his thumb hovering over the screen as if he could will them to disappear. He had seen devastation before, too much of it. But this was his daughter. Sergeant McAllister, his second in command, walked by, catching the tight expression on his face. Everything all right, Captain? William exhaled slowly, his grip tightening on the phone. I need to go home. McAllister raised a brow but didn't question him. Men like William Carter didn't leave unless it mattered. Let me make some calls, McAllister said. We'll get you out of here. William nodded, but his mind was already thousands of miles away, back in Willow Creek, back to his little girl, standing in front of the wreckage of everything she had built, and he wasn't there. The flight home felt longer than any deployment. Every delay, every layover, every second wasted in transit gnawed at him. By the time he pulled into Willow Creek, the afternoon sun was just beginning to dip behind the hills, casting long golden streaks across the town he had once known so well. But something felt different. People were gathering, not in fear, not in silence. They were working. William slowed the rental truck, his hands tightening around the steering wheel as his eyes landed on Emma. She was there, right where she had always been, at her lemonade stand. Only now, she wasn't alone. Linda from the cafe was stirring fresh lemonade in a giant glass pitcher. Walter, the ex-cop, was hammering together a new wooden frame. Mr. Wilson from the barbershop was painting a brand new sign. And standing beside Emma, helping count the donations that had already begun to pile up, was Ms. Avery, her school teacher. The stand wasn't just being rebuilt, it was being reborn. William stepped out of the truck, barely aware of his own movements. He watched as Emma, his little girl, smiled at a customer, handing over a cup with the same unshakable determination he had seen in soldiers before battle. She had refused to give up, and now, neither had the town. Emma. His voice was barely above a whisper, but she heard him. She turned, her breath catching, her eyes widening, and for the first time in a long time, the weight of everything she had held together seemed to hit her all at once. "Dad?" Before he could respond, she was running. William barely had time to brace himself before she crashed into him, her arms wrapping around his waist, her face buried against his chest. He held her tightly, his chin resting atop her head, his hand running over her hair like he used to when she was small. "I got here as fast as I could," he murmured, voice thick with emotion. Emma pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes still shining with the remnants of unshed tears. "I didn't stop, Dad," she whispered. "I didn't let them win." William swallowed hard, nodding. "I can see that." He looked around, at the people who had come together, at the town that refused to bow to fear. He had returned, expecting to pick up the pieces to fix what was broken. But nothing here was broken. Not Emma. Not Willow Creek. They were stronger than ever. Walter walked over, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Good to have you back, Carter." William shook his hand, squeezing firmly. "Good to be back." Walter motioned toward Emma. "You raised a hell of a kid." William looked down at his daughter, the fire in her eyes, the steel in her spine, and nodded. "No," he said. "She raised herself." Emma grinned, stepping back toward her lemonade stand, rolling up her sleeves like there was still work to be done. And for the first time since he got the call, William Carter knew everything was going to be okay. The rumble of motorcycles shattered the quiet of Willow Creek once more. Not like ghosts in the night this time. This time they wanted to be seen. The Iron Jackals weren't hiding. They rode straight down Main Street, their engines growling like hungry wolves, their presence a challenge rather than a warning. Emma was at her lemonade stand when she heard them. She didn't flinch, she didn't run. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, exhaled slowly, and stood her ground. And this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her, the people of Willow Creek watched, silent, unmoving. Walter stood with his arms crossed, jaw clenched. Linda was gripping a dish, towel so hard her knuckles turned white. Even Mr. Peterson, the grumpy old banker who usually minded his own business, had stepped onto the sidewalk, watching warily. The town was done being afraid. As the motorcycles came to a stop, Razor dismounted. First, he moved with the confidence of a man who had never been challenged, never been told no, and forced to accept it. Until now, because standing across from him, waiting calmly, was Captain William Carter. The two men locked eyes, one a battle-hardened Navy SEAL, the other a man who had built an empire on intimidation, different battlefields, different wars, but both knew what it was to lead men into darkness. William didn't move. He didn't need to. The silence stretched between them, thick as a storm on the horizon. Finally, Razor spoke. "So, you're the big hero back from war, huh?" His voice was steady, but something about the way he stood, not quite as sure, not quite as untouchable, hinted at something deeper. William tilted his head slightly, studying him. "I'm just a father." Razor let out a short laugh. "A father who thinks he can walk back into town and change things?" His eyes flicked toward Emma. "You think standing out here with your kid selling lemonade makes you stronger than me?" William's voice remained measured, controlled. "No, but I think standing up for something does." Razor scoffed, rolling his shoulders like he was shaking off an unseen weight. "You don't know a damn thing about me, Captain." William took a step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, but firm. "I know enough." Razor's jaw tightened. "You lost someone," William continued, his voice even. "Didn't you?" The words hit like a punch, though Razor didn't move. The street was so silent now that even the wind had stilled. The Jackals shifted uncomfortably, behind their leader, exchanging glances as if they knew where this was going but never dared to say it aloud. Razor's hands curled into fists, but not in anger, in restraint. "Shut up." William didn't. A sister, he guessed. Someone who should have had a fighting chance but didn't. Emma watched, heart pounding. She had never seen Razor hesitate before, but he was hesitating now. Razor turned away slightly, his breathing uneven, his eyes fixed on a distant point beyond the horizon. "She was 13, he muttered. 13. And they said there was nothing they could do." The weight of those words sat heavy in the air. William nodded slowly. "So you turned that anger into something else. Something you could control." Razor's lips pressed into a thin line. His walls were cracking. "You think I don't know what that feels like?" William said. "The helplessness, the rage, the need to make someone pay." His gaze softened just a fraction. "But you're not punishing the people who hurt her, Razor. You're punishing the ones trying to help." Razor exhaled sharply, like a man who had just been hit somewhere deep inside himself. His eyes darted to Emma, to the sign that read, "All proceeds go to help sick children at St. Jude's Hospital." The words might as well have been carved into stone. Everything he had been fighting against, this wasn't about power. This wasn't about control. This was about her memory, her legacy. And he had spent years destroying what he should have been protecting. For the first time, Razor didn't have a comeback. He didn't have a smirk, a sneer, or a threat. He just looked tired. His men were still watching, waiting. For what, he wasn't sure. Razor ran a hand through his hair, exhaling hard. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, he turned back to Emma. "I ever tell you," he said, his voice hoarse, "that my sister loved lemonade?" Emma blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in his tone. She shook her head. "No, she did," Razor muttered. "Used to make it every summer. She'd sell it for a quarter. Said she was saving up for a trip to the ocean." He let out a breath. "She never got to go." The silence stretched again, and then, in a move that no one in town could have predicted, Razor reached into his leather jacket, pulled out his wallet, and placed a crisp $100 bill into the donation jar. Emma stared at it. Razor's voice was quieter now. "For her." William nodded once. No more words were needed. Razor turned back to his crew, his voice calm but final. "We're done here." One by one, the Iron Jackals mounted their bikes, their engines roaring to life again, not as a threat this time, but as an ending. Razor was the last to leave. For a moment, he hesitated, looking back at Emma and the stand. One last time. Then, with a nod to William, he climbed onto his motorcycle and disappeared into the horizon. The town stood frozen. Then, Walter chuckled. "Well," he said, crossing his arms, "I'll be damned." Linda let out a long breath. "That just happened, right? I didn't imagine it." Emma looked down at the $100 bill in the donation jar. Then, for the first time since this all began, she smiled, and William Carter, standing beside. His daughter knew one thing for sure. Willow Creek had just changed forever. The morning after the confrontation, Willow Creek felt different. The tension that had loomed over the town for so long had lifted, replaced by something unfamiliar. Relief. The Iron Jackals were gone. Not just in body, but in presence. The usual sights of their motorcycles parked outside the old gas station, their riders loitering on street corners, the ever-present shadow of their control, all of it had vanished overnight. No one quite knew what to expect. Would they come back? Would Razor change his mind? But as the days passed, it became clear something had broken that night, something deeper than fear. At first, it was just whispers, A few jackals had been seen leaving town, their patches discarded. Others had shown up in nearby cities looking for honest work. And then Razor disappeared. No one knew where he went, and for a while, no one dared to ask. But Emma didn't wonder. She knew. He had found his way home. 1 week later, the stand was rebuilt, not just by Emma, but by the entire town. Walter was the first to show up, toolbox in hand, muttering something about damn kids these days not knowing how to reinforce wood properly. Then Linda arrived with paint, followed by Mr. Peterson, who, in a shocking display of generosity, offered to cover the cost of any new materials. Even strangers pitched in, and when it was done, it wasn't just a lemonade stand anymore. It was a symbol, a statement, that Willow Creek belonged to the people who refused to be afraid, and at the front of it all was Emma Carter. The grand reopening of Emma's lemonade stand for hope was met with a turnout unlike anything the town had ever seen. People lined up down the block. Emma, wearing a bright yellow apron, poured glass after glass, smiling as she handed them out. $1 became 10. 10 became hundreds. And before long, the donation jar was overflowing. Emma didn't just meet her goal, she surpassed it. More than enough to fund the Children's Hospital initiative. More than enough to ensure that kids like Razor's sister, wouldn't have to hear the words, "There's nothing we can do." The news spread. Local papers picked up the story, then state papers, then national. People from across the country sent in donations, moved by the resilience of one 12-year-old girl who refused to back down. And through it all, Emma never stopped smiling. She had kept her promise. That night, after the stand had closed and the last of the lemonade had been sold, Emma found something waiting for her, a small unmarked envelope, sitting right in the middle of the donation jar. She frowned, pulling it out. It wasn't sealed. Inside was a single stack of crisp $100 bills and a note. For her. Emma's breath caught. She looked around, but the street was empty. Razor was gone, but his presence remained. A part of her wondered if he had stood in that same spot earlier, watching from a distance, deciding, finally, fully, Dido. Let go. She exhaled, clutching the note tight in her hand, and then she smiled, not because of the money, not because of the donation, but because for the first time, she knew, really knew, that people could change, even the ones you least expect. Willow Creek was never the same after that. The town had been tested, pushed to the brink, but in the end, it had emerged stronger. People knew their worth now. They looked out for each other. They spoke up when something wasn't right, and fear, it had no place here anymore. Linda's cafe saw more business than ever, with people coming from nearby towns just to hear the lemonade story. Walter finally retired for good, no longer feeling like the town needed someone to protect it, and Emma, she kept going. Her stand became something bigger than her, a movement, a legacy. Somewhere far from Willow Creek, a man walked down a quiet road, the roar of motorcycles left behind him. He carried no leather jacket, no insignia, just the weight of choices, and, perhaps, the possibility of something new. If this story meant something to you, if you believe that change is possible, that kindness is stronger than fear, then let us know in the comments. Do you think people can truly change? Type yes. If you believe in second chances, or maybe you have a different take, let's talk about it. And if you want more stories like this, real stories of hope, courage, and the power of community, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because sometimes all it takes is one voice, one action, one choice to change everything.